Hello, everyone. Welcome to this month's Trade Justice Power Hour about the attack on AI accountability. My name is Arthur Stimoulis. I'm the Executive Director of the Trade Justice Education Fund. I'll be moderating today's discussion. So, as we all know, artificial intelligence is becoming more and more integrated throughout our society. It's not entirely unlike the internet was 30 years ago or electricity was 100 years ago. Today, AI is increasingly used in everything from social media to the military, banking to healthcare, the classroom to the workplace. And many people are rightly calling for oversight and accountability over this emerging technology. We don't want AI to exacerbate discrimination, to foster disinformation, to encourage mass surveillance, to exploit workers, destroy the environment, cause or worsen other harms. But many of the companies behind AI are weary of government regulation. They want to be able to use your financial data, your health data, your geolocation, your emails, texts, phone calls to train their AI systems. And they want to be able to ship that data across borders free from any personal privacy and data security restrictions so that they can both sell it to whoever they want and so that they can store and process it wherever they want, which not surprisingly is often wherever is the cheapest for them to do so, often meaning where workers are exploited and environmental regulations are very weak. Many of these companies also don't want to have to share information about their algorithms and their source code with regulators. In fact, they want to keep that information from regulators so that any sort of pre-screening of their technologies for safety and other concerns becomes virtually impossible. Now, they say this is needed to prevent other countries from stealing their inventions. But of course, there are already rules in place to prevent that. Agencies that regulate the pharmaceutical industry, for instance, have ready access to drug formulas, production methods, efficacy data, other information without any serious threat to pharmaceutical giants' intellectual property. Many AI companies, again, are trying to evade that sort of oversight and any type of accountability for their products. And they've actually tried to pass legislation that would ban AI regulations, but that legislation has been largely rejected and rejected on a bipartisan basis. So the plan B these companies and their lobbyists have adopted is to try to sneak policy handcuffs into trade agreements through these so-called digital trade rules that we've been sounding the alarm about for several years now. During the Biden administration, many of you helped us successfully fight back against this digital trade sneak attack. The Biden White House, you'll recall, withdrew U.S. support for big tech's digital trade agenda at the WTO and in other trade negotiating venues. But President Trump has since done a 180 on that position. He's not only back to carrying water for big tech in our trade negotiations, he's actually made big tech's digital trade agenda the number one priority of U.S. trade policy. It's the central part of his bilateral trade deals. It's the central thing he's leveraged from other nations with his high tariffs. If this continues, the ability to ensure effective oversight and accountability over AI will become increasingly difficult, if not impossible, not only here, but around the world. So to discuss this issue, we're joined today by two of the people most steeped in AI accountability among our friends at Public Citizen. First, we're going to hear from Alana Beller, who leads Public Citizen's work regulating AI in the States. She's going to give us a crash course on what AI is, why AI accountability matters, and maybe even some of the best practices advocates are suggesting for better overseeing AI's deployment. Then we're going to hear from Rishab Bailey, the research director of the Digital Trade Alliance. He's done really important work mapping big tech's demands for the Trump trade agenda, and he'll explain how advancing such trade rules would undermine the AI accountability that Alana and so many others are pushing for. Once they've both spoken, I'm going to share a really quick action item that we hope you'll all take, and then we'll open it up to any of your questions or brief comments. Of course, you don't have to wait until the end to send your question or comment. Please enter those anytime as we go along using the Zoom's Q&A feature, which you should be able to find towards the bottom of your screen. With that, let me turn things over to our presenters. Alana and Rishab, thank you so much for being with us today. We really appreciate it. Alana, please get us started.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Arthur. I'm going to share my screen. All right. Let me make this full screen. Okay. All right. So, as Arthur mentioned, my name is Ilana Beller. I work for Public Citizen and I lead our state legislative work relating to artificial intelligence. I've had the opportunity to work with lawmakers in almost all 50 states to pass common sense AI regulations. I was asked to kind of do a basic overview of AI in the landscape, so I do want to start with the very basics. What is AI? And sorry for those who for whom this is too basic, but I just want to make sure we're all on the same playing field here. Artificial intelligence, often referred to as AI, is computer systems that can perform tasks and that usually require human intelligence or reasoning. So the very high level of how this works is the AI is fed huge amounts of data. It uses that data to learn to identify patterns and rules, and then it takes its understanding of those patterns and rules to ultimately make predictions. Um, the technology is evolving incredibly rapidly, and it has many implications for our society. I'm going to go into a handful of those implications, but as Arthur mentioned earlier, this is going to be something that affects every corner of society. And so there would be no way for me to cover that in its entirety, nor do I even know all of the ways in which it's going to affect our society. All right, so I do want to start with the environmental implications. Many of you have likely heard about data centers. They are huge warehouses filled with thousands of computers that are needed to process, store, and distribute the immense amount of data that's needed for AI technology. They require immense amounts of electricity, um, more than some entire nations. And in places where these data centers are set up, electricity prices will often raise. And it is worth noting that a lot of the electricity comes from energy sources such as coal, oil, and gas, which of course have significant environmental consequences. It's also worth noting that a lot of water is needed to cool these centers. As you can imagine, when there are thousands of computers in one place, it can get really hot. And so this actually takes a lot of water as well. And there are electronic waste byproducts that come from these facilities as well. There are also a lot of data and privacy implications. I'm going to just share some top lines of those as well. Um, so these models are trained on massive amounts of personal data. It's worth noting as well that there's can be a ton of bias in the data sets. So if you think about all of the information that is present on the internet, we know that there is a lot of bias, whether it be any form of bias, racism, sexism, ableism, etc., that is present in the data that these models have access to, and that can absolutely manifest in how they ultimately kind of present and come to their predictions or the information that they give to the user. The information is often in what we call a black box. So we don't know frequently how AI gets from point A to point B, which can have a lot of implications in terms of like concerns around the veracity and also, you know, the source of the information. They're prone to hallucinations, so they can very confidently convey misinformation. Um, and then it's, you know, in terms of the user's data, data is often sold to third parties, often without the user knowing that they're consenting, and sometimes even without the user's consent if they're not aware that they're being recorded. Private information and chat logs are prone to leaks and hacking. And it Arthur kind of mentioned this briefly, but the storage of data can be in other countries, and these data breaches can be used by foreign governments. So again, there are many, many concerns. A few others that I do just want to mention here briefly before digging into one or two of them in depth and this I think is getting a lot of news attention, but of course there are concerns relating to job replacement by AI. There are many concerns relating to the use of AI in the healthcare systems. So, whether that would be AI making decisions for a person's care, or AI being used to make decisions on whether or not someone's claim is accepted or denied. By a healthcare provider. So, just across the field of healthcare, AI is being implemented in critical decision-making processes. There's a ton of concerns relating to misinformation and deception. I'm actually going to go in depth on some of the concerns relating to deep fakes. Public Citizen also does a lot of work relating to concerns relating to chatbots. Um, Also, with everything in the news recently relating to the Pentagon and Claude, you probably heard about some of the concerns relating to autonomous weapons and mass surveillance of the public. Again, these are just some of the many concerns. As I mentioned, I did want to talk a little bit in depth on some of the concerns that we do a lot of work to address relating to deep fakes. So specifically, Public Citizen has been working with lawmakers in states all across the country to pass laws to regulate both non-consensual intimate deep fakes and election deep fakes. Very briefly, what a deepfake is content. It could be an audio, image, video that is generated using AI technology that depicts someone doing or saying something they never actually did or said. So an intimate deepfake would depict someone in an intimate act. Um, Non-consensual intimate deepfakes make up 98% of all deepfakes on the internet, and the vast majority of the victims are women and girls. And unfortunately, a disturbingly large percentage of children, so 13% of teens, say that they have some sort of experience with non-consensual intimate deepfakes. These are unfortunately becoming ever more common. And so we've worked with lawmakers in almost every state to pass laws that directly ban distributing this type of deepfake without someone's consent. Another concern that we work with frequently is election deepfakes. These are deepfakes used in an election context to try and undermine a candidate's reputation and otherwise deceive a voter. We've also worked with folks in dozens of states across the country to pass laws that would require clear labeling and disclosure of this type of content so that a viewer would know that the content is not real when they're interacting with it. Finally, very briefly on the regulatory landscape, very little has come out of the federal government thus far on this, with the sad exception being numerous attempts in the last year to preempt any kind of state regulation. So, really, most of the action in terms of any kind of protections on this front has come from state legislation, state governments, and the federal government has done almost nothing, but has put a lot of effort into trying to override those state laws and say that the states can't regulate in this area. The states, on the other hand, have passed numerous bipartisan common sense laws that put guardrails in place to protect the American people from some of the most obvious and egregious concerns relating to the harms of AI. These also happen to be very popular amongst the public. And so, yeah, most of the action is happening at the state level. Happy to talk with anyone at any point about what that looks like in more detail. Public Citizen has 5 model bills that we're working on currently. As I mentioned, the non-consensual intimate deepfake legislation, election deepfake regulation, requirements around chatbot disclosure, requirements to protect children from emotionally manipulative AI chatbots, and uh, some regulations around AI in the healthcare coverage decision-making space. And with that, I'm happy to take questions. I think I might have gone over time. Apologies if I did, Arthur, but yes.
No, you're all good. Thank you so much, Alana. That was extremely helpful background. I know you're not able to stay for the full hour, so first, just want to again voice our deep appreciation for you being here, and also maybe want to slip in one question before we turn it over to Rishab. You mentioned that the states are really where a lot of the regulatory efforts are moving, much more so than the federal government. I'm curious both if you have any views on why preemption at the international level would be so dangerous while we continue fighting it at the federal level, but also if there are any other sort of best practices, better regulatory efforts that you want to flag for folks before we jump into the next presentation.
Yeah, certainly the states are the ones who are doing the work here to put the guardrails in place. This technology is new. It's impacting every part of our lives. And the idea that it should go completely unregulated as it is integrated into everything we do, and in many cases is causing very clear harms, just as not reasonable. There has to be guardrails. This is extremely powerful technology, and the states are doing that work. I would say the reason why I think lawmakers at the state level are really engaging with this. Um, I talk with lawmakers, state lawmakers all day, every day, and it is very apparent that they're hearing from their constituents consistently about very real concerns and they're disturbed by it, right? Like state lawmakers are very connected with the public frequently. They talk with constituents all of the time if they're if they're engaging, which hopefully they are, and they're hearing about problems in real time. There are very real problems that are popping up, whether it be related to non-consensual intimate deepfakes, concerns related to harms from chatbots, healthcare, et cetera, all of the various things that I mentioned. And they recognize that there's a need for regulation and there's a need to have guardrails. And so they're doing that work. And I only hope that people will, that folks at the federal level and the international level will follow that lead and do that really critical work. So, yep, thanks.
Yeah, thank you again. We really appreciate it. Next, let's turn things over to Rishab Bailey, the research director of the Digital Trade Alliance. Rishab?
Thank you, Arthur. Let me just share my slides. Uh, can you see what I'm sharing?
Yep, that's perfect.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to join all of you today. Now, Ilana has already covered some of the basics of AI, why we need to regulate this really useful but also scary technology, as well as the sort of current state of affairs domestic policy wise. I'm going to be a little more un-PC and say that broadly, the story is that the federal government, on behalf of its big tech donors, has been pushing really hard to kill domestic attempts at regulating the digital ecosystem broadly, not just AI, both through federal deregulation and by dropping enforcement actions against big tech companies. I plan to briefly, in my presentation, cover the other side of this, how big tech is using its proximity to Trump, the Trump administration, to push for global deregulation of the tech space and what this means for the development of AI. Now, I think you're all aware of the proximity between big tech and this administration. I mean, the examples of this are so numerous that it's impossible to actually list all of them. I mean, they range from the sort of massive donations made to Trump's campaign, his inauguration fund, his ballroom redevelopment project. Of course, they love hobnobbing over dinner and drinks and so forth. And in return for all of this, the Trump administration is basically using the trade tools at its disposal to push for global tech deregulation. So the administration's intent to go to bat for big tech was made very clear in the first few months of Trump's taking office early last year. So in January last year, the president unveiled his America First trade policy, following which he implemented his reciprocal tariffs in April. Now, it's important to focus on two things that fed into the decision-making process behind these tariffs. The first was a special report by the US Trade Representative, which interestingly has not been disclosed to the public. We've actually filed a FOIA request for this report, but it's gone unanswered. So we've actually filed a lawsuit against the administration, which is still pending. Nonetheless, we suspect that this report was largely informed by industry comments. The second input is the National Trade Estimates Report. Now, the NTE report, is an annual report released by the US Trade Representative that basically claims to list non tariff trade barriers that US companies face. So it's by and large been a laundry list of complaints that US industry raises with other countries' laws and practices. Most of the report is actually quite ridiculous. So, for instance, it complains that other countries don't automatically accept US safety standards for drug approvals, or it'll say things like, Muslim majority countries require meat or poultry to adhere to halal standards and so on. But this report has become really important now because it's what basically President Trump waved around while announcing his reciprocal tariffs back in April. So he basically linked the imposition of these punitive tariffs to the supposed non tariff barriers identified by the USTR in the NT report. And of course, his rhetoric has continued since then, particularly on social media, or Truth Social, where he's frequently threatened countries for regulating the digital ecosystem. So, what are all these non tariff barriers that big tech and their lobby groups are complaining about? Now, we mapped out the comments submitted by groups that are known lobbying fronts for big tech to the USTR's reciprocal tariffs report. That is the report that's being withheld from the public. Now, as you can see on your screen, the comments of these industry lobby groups attack a host of digital regulations around the world, over 100 laws and policies in over 45 different jurisdictions. You can actually go to our website and sort of play around with this map, with this data. Now, the targets of attack include anti monopoly laws or laws that seek to prevent consumers or smaller businesses from the dominance of big tech companies, data protection and privacy laws, for instance, that try and ensure companies can't misuse our personal data, revenue sharing regulations, so, for example, laws that require big tech companies to compensate news producers for using their content. Various forms of taxation apply to big tech companies, online safety regulations, and many, many more. Of particular interest to this conversation, though, are six jurisdictions whose AI laws are mentioned: Canada, the European Union, Brazil, Australia, Korea, and the UAE, all of which are relatively early adopters of AI regulation. We also mapped the comments of industry lobby groups to the USTR's next NTE report, which will be released at the end of this month. This exercise actually then shows us that the demands of tech companies have only increased in the 1 year that Trump has been in power. We now, in fact, see that digital regulations in over 60 jurisdictions are targeted, with the number of regulations and policies under attack also rising into the multiple hundreds. So we counted over 350, but then gave up because it was just too many. Uh, AI regulations being targeted have also more than doubled to 13 jurisdictions now. So you have Ecuador, Colombia, Saudi Arabia, Kenya, Malaysia, Vietnam, Japan, Taiwan, added to those that I already mentioned. What these two exercises basically show us is what the shopping list of big tech is. What are the deregulatory demands being made for the Trump administration to then go around and bully countries into? And unfortunately, this appears to be working to some degree. A number of countries have relaxed or given up on some of their digital regulations even before trade negotiations can actually happen. So, for example, India withdrew a tax it applied on foreign digital advertising services, while Australia stopped implementing its news bargaining code, which is a law that required social media platforms to share some of their revenue with the news industry, who they've been cannibalizing. Others have been forced to give up, other countries that is, have been forced to give up on various other methods of regulating big tech in order to bring Trump to the negotiating table. So, for instance, Canada was forced to withdraw its plans to tax big tech companies just to get Trump to the negotiating table. More worrying are the series of extremely one sided trade deals that many Latin American and Asian countries have signed up to over the past few months. You must have seen Trump touting many of these as wins. All these agreements, however, contain sweeping commitments that significantly limit how the signatories, which are mostly smaller countries that can't stand up to US bullying, how they can regulate the digital ecosystem and emerging technologies such as AI. So let me illustrate by going through some of the issues that big tech has demanded and that the Trump administration is forcing other countries to agree to. Now, the first provision concerns source code and algorithmic disclosure. So, for those who aren't familiar, source code basically refers to the machine readable series of instructions that a computer program uses to perform a particular task. Now, of course, the growth of the AI ecosystem and the integral nature of software to our lives means it's really important to be sure that a computer program actually does what it says, especially when it's being used for really important things like, hiring and firing, determining credit or social benefit eligibility, or even say predictive policing. Software can be programmed to serve illicit purposes or can have baked in biases or other unintended consequences. So, one of the ways in which you can try and prevent this is to actually scrutinize the source code of a program or an AI system. Basically, you open up the black box that Ilana referred to previously. However, what big tech is doing is pushing for these trade agreements to include clauses that prohibit governments, regulators, and independent researchers and third parties from accessing source code except under very, very narrow circumstances. This, of course, can be problematic because it means no one can actually examine how an algorithm or source code, that is the basic components of an AI system, work before they are actually deployed into the public. This means that till an incident occurs, regulators and even independent third parties can't scrutinize a software product for possible defects or downstream harms such as bias and discrimination, which we're all aware of. So, as Arthur sort of pointed out, essentially this is akin to a drug being released in the market without a regulator being able to assess the safety and efficacy of the product. Also, given that most countries are still trying to figure out how exactly to regulate AI system, it makes very little sense to actually give up the ability to look under the hood of these systems at this very early stage. Indeed, a number of proposed and extant AI related laws, whether it's in the US or in countries like the EU and others, can be challenged using these provisions. The second issue concerns cross border data flows. Now, we all know that data is an extremely valuable resource today, particularly given its use for AI training. And so, who controls this data and how it's used is an important public policy question for all governments. Now, while there are problems with overly broad restrictions on cross border data flows, because it could restrict expression rights and so on, there are also many legitimate reasons a government might need to regulate such flows of data. So, for example, they may need to ensure that domestic data protection, privacy, or cybersecurity law can be applied to the data. Equally, many countries are thinking about new data governance regimes that require non personal data to be shared amongst businesses rather than allowing it all to be monopolized by big tech companies. But practically speaking, data is subject to the laws of the jurisdiction where it's physically located, and enforcement of these laws may be difficult if the data is moved offshore. There may also be a need to ensure that data is made accessible to domestic regulators to perform supervisory or administrative functions, or that it can be used to promote domestic economic growth, part of the whole digital sovereignty narrative, which is becoming increasingly prevalent around the world. So, big tech is therefore pushing for these provisions that will force countries to allow their data to be exported to the US, which has very poor privacy regulations, or indeed other jurisdictions which have even lesser protections without any limitations or restrictions. So, in short, this means that companies will be free to take your data abroad, where it could be traded, used to train AI, or otherwise misused, irrespective of what your domestic law actually says. A third important issue is that of non discrimination. Now, non discrimination itself is a foundational principle of international trade law. Simply put, it means that a country has to treat similar products or services arriving from different countries similarly. However, this concept is increasingly being abused by big tech companies to challenge any regulation that adversely affects them. Basically, what big tech companies are doing is claiming that any law, even if it's applicable to all the players in a given ecosystem, can be considered discriminatory just because it has a greater effect on them. Which, of course, most laws will, because these companies tend to be the biggest players in any market. Now, we're all aware that many sectors of the digital economy are highly concentrated for a variety of reasons, ranging from first mover advantages to economies of scale, network effects, and so on. This allows big tech companies to get away with a host of behaviors that harm both users and smaller companies. So we're all aware, of the kind of one-sided terms and conditions that we're all forced to sign up to when we try and use any of these services. So, to combat such practices, a number of jurisdictions are trying to implement pro competition regulations or asymmetric obligations to target large or dominant players. So, for example, the European Union has implemented what they call the Digital Markets Act to create a more level playing field. You also have more targeted initiatives such as that in Korea, which implemented a law to regulate app stores because they have discriminatory and anti-competitive behavior. For example, they don't allow you to pay using third-party apps and so on. Now, a number of countries have also put in place online safety laws that, put in place graded obligations on platforms based on their size or their reach or the user base. Similarly, in the AI ecosystem, a number of laws place higher regulatory demands on bigger platforms or systems, basically those that pose a greater risk. All of these kinds of measures are susceptible to challenge using these so-called anti-discrimination provisions. And as to how these provisions can be misused, we've already seen the US Trade Representative launch an investigation into, for example, Brazil's digital policies, including their data protection law, as well as social media regulations, including laws regarding deepfakes in the electoral context. So, based on this investigation, the US can then impose tariffs on Brazilian imports. We're now likely to see the initiation of a host of other Section 301 investigations as Trump needs to find alternate authorities to impose his tariffs after the Supreme Court decision last month. We've already seen two such investigations being started into forced labor practices and excess capacity in certain sectors, but I think it's only a matter of time before digital regulations are also caught in the crossfire. Separately, the Republican majority in Congress has also held a number of hearings on behalf of big tech, naming and shaming various jurisdictions, for example, the European Union, Korea, Brazil, and so on, for implementing digital regulations. Specifically in the AI context, many of you may be aware that the recent sort of global controversy around AI and unification apps. A number of countries ranging from India, Indonesia, Malaysia, the UK, European Union, and so on, have banned or are otherwise trying to regulate access to such systems. All of these attempts could then be challenged under trade agreement provisions that relate to non discrimination or even provisions related to the need to protect foreign investments. In addition, it's also important to keep in mind that while the US is pushing for deregulation, including in the AI space, it's also pushing really hard for other countries to enhance market access for its big tech and AI companies. So basically, this means that not only are countries going to be forced to use US based AI systems, they'll be unable to effectively prevent harms that arise from these very systems. Of course, what I've covered today is a very limited glimpse into the sort of deregulatory agenda being pushed by big tech. But one really important takeaway is that big tech is super clever. They know way more about the direction technology is taking than most governments, and this allows them to preempt any regulatory attempts before governments are fully aware of just how much power they are handing over. So, for instance, when Trump renegotiated NAFTA during his first administration into the USMCA, the US Mexico Canada agreement, the big tech lobby successfully snuck in this digital trade chapter that included really bad provisions on source code, data flow, and non discrimination before anyone really understood what the implications would be. But now, in the upcoming USMCA review, the process which has already started, big tech companies are actually pushing for even more provisions that would further limit the ability of the signatory countries, the US, Mexico, and Canada, to regulate emerging technologies such as AI as well as quantum computing. So, specifically, big tech has enlarged its demands to ensure that regulators and governments are barred from accessing what they call model weights. That is, basically the value assigned to different input parameters that an algorithm considers when it's making a decision. They also want to allow AI systems to be trained for free on copyrighted content, basically allow them to steal everyone's work. And also, they want to prevent the development of local standards and certification mechanisms. So basically, we're seeing an undercutting of yet to be developed AI regulations and without any proper democratic debate or discussion. So the citizens of all these countries get no say whatsoever on any of these issues. So to conclude, big tech has found a willing ally in the White House to do their bidding on domestic and a global basis. They fund Trump in exchange for him bullying countries to sign up to trade agreements that significantly affect their ability to regulate the digital ecosystem, while also pushing for countries to buy more US made AI products. This obviously could have significant impacts, not just on civil rights in the online space, but it also affects the wide variety of social and economic relationships that AI and other technologies have increasingly come to intermediate. Think, for instance, of the rise of algorithmic management and how the lack of transparency in such systems can change relations between labor and management. Another important aspect to consider is the establishment of a new colonialist extractivist paradigm in the AI space, which will basically see global south countries export raw materials in the form of data, which are then converted to AI products by US based tech companies and then sold back to developing countries at a premium. But we are beginning to see some pushback. So, for example, Malaysia has said that it considers its reciprocal trade deal with the US to be null and void following the Supreme Court's repeal. And in many other countries, citizens have launched constitutional appeals to these deals, which have been negotiated under extreme secrecy and, of course, in great haste. Even domestically, we've had, for instance, more than 100 members of Congress writing to the USTR about the USMCA review and demanding that bad digital trade provisions should be removed from this. Also, because now big tech is pointing to the USMCA as a fait accompli and saying that these digital trade provisions must now be ceded in every other trade agreement. We at Public Citizen are also, of course, working with allies domestically and internationally to drag the murkiness of this deal making that Trump is engaged in into the sunlight and to try and raise awareness of the harmful implications of these sort of big tech friendly trade deals. Um, I think I'll end there. Um, Happy to take any questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rishab. That was extremely helpful and a ton of great information to people. In a second, I'm going to open things to folks' questions and any brief comments. If you have those, again, please enter them using the Q&A function on your screen. I can see and monitor them much more easily in the Q&A than in the chat. So please use that Q&A function if you're at all able. While folks are doing that, let me just reiterate what I said at the start and what Rishab's presentation helped illustrate so clearly. Um, and that's that giveaways to big tech are currently the number one priority of President Trump's trade agenda. They dominate the terms of his bilateral trade deals. They're the top thing his administration demands from other countries in exchange for lower tariffs. Not the policies needed to create jobs, to increase wages, to ensure a more level playing field for working people across borders, or even to diversify global supply chains. No. The number one priority of US trade policy under President Trump is tax cuts and deregulation for big tech billionaires. And the main reason that they're getting away with this is because not enough people are talking about it. Not enough people are holding them accountable for it. Now, many of you on the line have long been at the forefront of demanding accountability from our government so that they can't rig trade rules in the interests against the interests of working people and the planet and in the interests of billionaires and corporations. So I'm asking you to please speak out once again. My colleague Clayton is going to post a link in the chat to an easy online tool you can use to write the administration and let them know you're watching, that the jig is up, that they're trying to rig trade rules to prevent AI accountability and that you won't put up with it. Please take a moment now to take that quick action. And when you're done, please share it with others. If you're on social media, please share it there or just email it to friends and family and colleagues. We are the ones who need to sound the alarm on this. So please do that now. And also share the clips from today's Power Hour that Clayton and I will be emailing you soon, likely early tomorrow, so that other folks can hear Rishab and Alana's great presentations. With that, let's go now to your questions. Again, if you have any, please type them in using Zoom's Q&A. So one question is what's the response to the argument that algorithm and source code secrecy rules are needed to prevent other countries from stealing companies' intellectual property and other confidential information?
I think that's actually it's an interesting question, but it's something that Arthur you already basically addressed in your initial comments, which is we already have mechanisms to ensure secrecy of information provided to regulators. Because let's not forget, you are providing these to identified institutions that already have practices in place to deal with confidential information. So, for example, competition authorities in every country have access to huge amounts of sensitive material about the way a business functions. They already have practices to make sure that this isn't shared. Similarly, intellectual property regulators patent offices and so on already have huge amounts of confidential information, which typically is not shared with competitors in the country. So I think this is just a red herring which is being raised by industry. Yes, there are some genuine examples of countries trying to copy technology. But I think these are overstated. It's not every jurisdiction where this happens, and as I said, there are means to get around this. In addition, another interesting sort of thing to consider in this entire debate is the whole cleavage between proprietary AI systems and open source AI systems also. There is this debate happening globally. We've seen, for example, China in particular release many of their AI models. They release the code for the models, which means anyone can use and develop these models on their own. Well, to be fair, Facebook has also done that. A number of other countries, however, or a number of other companies have proprietary models which they want to keep secret, which is where the trouble starts.
Great, thank you. There are a number of questions about AI data centers, and they basically boil down to like why should folks fighting AI data centers in their communities care about digital trade, and what's an easy way to explain that to people who aren't steeped in all the trade lingo?
Well, the easy way is that one, digital trade rules are unfortunately enforceable. Unlike most aspects of international law, which we now know is basically, let's say, it's whatever the powerful decide, international trade law is actually enforceable. So when countries say that they will not regulate a particular type of technology, they can then be sued and have to face damages of one kind or another, which is why it becomes important to prevent these kind of provisions being put into trade agreements, because then they can be used to stop regulation that affects you, me, and people abroad. It's not just people in countries outside the US, but domestically as well. So, just as an example, there are many states in the US which have implemented laws that limit how your biometric information can be used. So, for example, Montana and California, for example, have really strong privacy related rules. And they require biometric data to be processed only within the states to prevent it being taken abroad and then misused, where the local law will not be applicable. But if a trade agreement says you cannot stop me from taking the data out of a jurisdiction, then these local state laws will not matter or they could be sued. Uh, which is why it's really, really important to try and make sure that these trade deals, which are entirely secretive, no one knows what's happening, civil society doesn't get a chance to uh, comment on these things mostly, which is why it's really important to keep them out of these spaces. Trade spaces are not where we should be making decisions on critical technology. Trade negotiators don't have the expertise on technology, they don't have the expertise, the social effects of these technologies. So trade is trade spaces are only concerned with looking at commercial and economic effects, which is why when you try to discuss these technologies which have broader social implications, trade is just not the space to do it in. I hope that clarifies. Also, just to tie it up to actually a question in the comments about the very, very technical terminology. That's something that I struggle with every day because the two sort of spaces I work in, both technology and trade, are just filled with jargon. But the idea of the Digital Trade Alliance, which is this network, a coalition that I help coordinate, is to try and bring digital rights groups and their expertise into the trade space. Because very often we find that, we don't have trade negotiators talking to the technology people. Because again, terminology, learning about these new spaces is always difficult. And so part of the thing that we are trying to do is try and demystify and try and make it easier for people to understand. So, just on source code, for example, we have published a couple of fact sheets. I've thrown one into the chat. There are many others on different issues as well. Um, we try to use these to educate the public at large, but also trade negotiators, particularly in global south countries.
Very helpful. So somebody asked, is big tech's trade agenda going to be part of the Days of Solidarity? I will take that one. And appreciate you asking. I was supposed to raise this and might have forgotten if you hadn't put that. So this May and June, civil society groups across the US, Canada, and Mexico are coming together for what are called the Cross-Border Days of Solidarity against Trump's rigged trade agenda. People are going to be meeting at actions along the borders in places like Buffalo and El Paso and Blaine, Washington and San Diego, as well as in the interiors of our countries to demonstrate that people will not put up with trying to pit working people in one country against one another, that we recognize we have a lot of the same shared interests, and that people want their governments to support policies that help people of the planet, not just greedy corporations. Um, so the Days of Solidarity, and Clayton, maybe you could put the link in the chat. It's daysofsolidarity.org, so easy for folks to remember. These Days of Solidarity aren't exclusively about stopping big tech's trade agenda, but that's certainly a big part of it. And there's actually a kickoff a webinar launching the Days of Solidarity that everyone here is absolutely invited to. That's taking place this coming Wednesday, March 25th at 6 p.m. Eastern. And Clayton, if you could please paste a separate link in the chat to that directly, I'd appreciate that as well. And we'll make sure this is in the follow-up email as well. But these Days of Solidarity are the biggest cross-border mobilization against Trump's rigged trade agenda to date, and we could really use folks' support on that. So there's a lot of requests for your slides. Again, we will share the video for this tomorrow. It'll be on our YouTube page, and we'll get an email out to folks. But you're okay with sharing your slides as well? Excellent.
Absolutely. Arthur, just to quickly jump in, I mean, I saw an interesting comment which I thought I should address from Charles. I know all of this sounds really awful, despondency, pessimism, all that stuff. But if we go home and say this doesn't matter or that we're going to insulate ourselves from it, that's when they win. There are lots of examples of victories which are largely because people come together and say this matters to us. And I think that is why things like these solidarity events are really, really important. If we all go back home and say this is not worth fighting for, they're always going to win. Yes, they might win, but we still need to make a fair fist of it or make a fight of it.
And for me to piggyback on that, when the Biden administration came in, they were planning to move forward initially with this digital trade agenda that big tech had been pushing. And because so many people on this line and in many of the groups that Rishab works with educated policymakers and fought back, they they stopped pushing that agenda at the WTO and in other venues. And for folks who've been doing trade work for a while, I mean, we're always fighting the biggest, most powerful economic interests in human history. And we've got a long track record of, derailing the TPP, derailing the FTAA, stopping the millennial round of WTO expansion. It is a long slog, but we have a lot more power than people sometimes acknowledge, and we just need to use that power. So here's a question. This isn't really a question. This is more of a statement that I thought was interesting. Um, it says, as Trump promotes trade rules blocking AI regulation around the world, he's also taken steps to dismantle the CHIPS Act and other initiatives aimed at boosting advanced manufacturing in the US. As such, imports of advanced microchips have already increased under his second term by about 60% to more than $450 billion a year. That's a significant chunk of the country's overall trade deficit. Other countries are making the chips that power AI, electric vehicles, and more, and the US is seeing none of those manufacturing jobs. I don't know if you have any reaction to that comment. I thought it was an interesting one.
It is. A couple of things. One is that relatively the US is still in a very good position, also because it has companies like Nvidia and so on that are based here. I mean, I'm talking about most of the other countries in the world which have absolutely nothing compared to the US. But that said, you are correct. Trump's entire line of reasoning for his supposed trade policy that he's going to try and bring jobs back to the US, he's going to have technology developed in the US, none of it happens without adequate investments into manufacturing facilities, into research and development, and most importantly, into education. And if you look at the kind of funding cuts that have been put in place by this government in public universities into R&D, it's massive, and it will have effects for generations to come here in the United States. Similarly, manufacturing does not reappear overnight. It's taken 20 years for the US to sort of give away, in a sense, its manufacturing. You're not gonna have factories open tomorrow just because Trump said, hey, it would be really nice. There needs to be an ecosystem created for manufacturing to return to the United States in a multiplicity of ways. And again, talent is one critical area. And you look at the number of STEM sort of people, students being produced here. You look at the number of PhDs in sciences being produced here. It is decreasing. And that is, I think, to me, really, really worrying, just from an American perspective, even though I'm not an American. Um, I think we are being sold a lie. It requires far bigger thinking than just saying we're going to bully this one little country to deregulate, or we're going to bully, Nvidia to give the US government 10% of its shareholding in order to make America great again. That's all just rubbish.
Great, thank you. So someone is asking about like a fact sheet or a reference that they can send to legislators that explains tech and trade agreements, and maybe something with pictures. It reminds me that Trade Justice Ed Fund does have a like sort of an infographic palm card that we could send in a follow-up email. And I don't know if Digital Trade Alliance has a simple intro fact sheet or something like that, but we can circulate that as well for sure.
Uh, we do have fact sheets on various subjects, and the FAQ section on the DTA website also sort of details the broad story about why digital trade matters, what the issues are. Do take a look at our website.
And Clayton, I don't know if the I can't even remember if the palm card is online or not, or was just in print format. But if you have a link handy, let's share that now, and we'll circulate that after the fact as well. So I think we have time for one, maybe two more questions. Um, Someone has asked, I don't know if this is a good one or not, but I'll ask it anyways. Why has Trump prioritized big tech's agenda in his trade agenda?
Okay, that's a really interesting question, and I think there are two aspects to it. The first and very obvious one is, of course, grift or corruption. Um, as I said, the big tech has paid in, and they're going to expect something in return. It's clear that to some extent, anyway, the Trump administration does act on that basis. I mean, even if you look at some of their other policies, it entirely depends on who's paying them to do what. So that's one very clear aspect with this particular administration. But there's also another story behind this, which is why there's sometimes bipartisan agreement on how to regulate or not regulate, as the case may be, the technology ecosystem, which is that big tech serves an important geopolitical and economic tool for the United States. Um, we know, for instance, how big tech companies make a huge amount of money for the US. Um, we also know that big tech companies have harvest data from around the world, which can be used, for instance, by law enforcement and intelligence agencies here. I don't know if many of you may remember the Snowden um, disclosures from about 10 years ago, which showed how the American security establishment is in bed with big tech companies. So there is a national security geopolitical aspect to this as well. But as far as this administration is concerned, I would suggest that it's largely grift.
Right. And I'm going to ask one more question, and that has to do with politically, where do we see bipartisan alignment? Our members are seeing alignment with the right on regulation of AI, on data centers, for example. Um, and maybe, so any thoughts on that, but also just like what, there's a lot of questions about data centers and their explosion in recent years and like what is the end game of the
So,
corporation
well,
and all
actually,
this.
we have some of my colleagues at Public Citizen spend all their time working on data centers. So I'd be more than happy to introduce you to them. Maybe we should do another session just on data centers because it is an increasingly important issue, and I'd be more than happy to make the introductions if necessary. Sorry, I forgot
Well,
the initial part of
bipartisan
the.
alignment,
Oh,
opportunity
yes.
for, new
It's
coalition.
actually interesting, because there has been bipartisan alignment for a number of years on the need to regulate different aspects of the technology ecosystem. Um, to my mind, so for example, you look at in 2023, the House Judiciary Committee wrote this really, really big and important report on how you need to regulate big tech from a competition perspective, including, for example, breaking up big tech and stuff like that. There was bipartisan consensus on the problems. Where it broke down was on the remedies, on how do you go about actually trying to deal with this problem. So I do feel that there is a lot of consensus on what the issues are. It tends to be how do you deal with them where the problems arise. And of course, the fact that unfortunately the American electoral system rewards those who are close to big business, um, which is what sort of skews the entire game here.
Excellent. Well, with that, we're going to wrap up for today. Everyone, please look out tomorrow for our follow-up email. Be sure to take the actions listed. Thank you, everyone, for being here, and thank you especially Rishab, and please again pass our thanks out to Alana for all the expertise today. We really appreciated it. Have a
Thank
great
you.
afternoon,
It's been a
everyone.
pleasure.
Take care.